Hi there, welcome back to the Bible Project. We're at part 32 of our journey together through the book of Genesis, and we've reached Genesis chapter 3, verse 9, and I've called this episode Paradise Lost. I'd remind you that the transcript of all these podcasts is available in the podcast notes section on the audio version of the podcast available on the Buzzsprout website. I grew up in Northern Ireland near an area called Strangford Lough, and there was a place on the shore of that loch where once in a while when there was a very low tide you could see the remains of a rusty old car. The rumour was that some drunken teenager had driven that car into the sea at low tide and then couldn't get it out. Now those of you who maybe have your own children, I'd like to do a bit of a thought experiment with you. I'd like you to imagine that it's your child's 18th birthday, and imagine that you're in a good enough financial position that you're able to buy that child a brand new car and present it with them on their birthday. But then imagine that child on the first day took that car and knowingly and willfully and deliberately went out and destroyed it. Imagine they drove it into the sea, like this car I talked about, at low tide and just left it there deliberately for the tide to come in and cover it over. But imagine that you lived by that beach and that every day as you sat there in your house and you watched as the tide went in and out, you could see that car that you had bought as a gift out of love just rusting and gradually decaying. How would that make you feel? How would you feel if that had been your son or daughter and that they had done that? Now I'll just pause for a moment and let you think about that, about what your response might be and what might the response of your heart might be. The reason I do that, because that's really the closest analogy I can come up with to think of what happened to God the Father in relation to his perfect creation, his perfect gift for Adam and Eve. He created Adam and Eve and he didn't give them a new car, but he gave them a perfect place to dwell, a paradise, and he gave them the possibility of having and experiencing everything they needed there. But then, having enjoyed it for a short time, they deliberately, knowingly, went out and disobeyed him, destroying their relationship with him and destroying that garden paradise. Now, in the last podcast, you may remember we considered the nature of temptation. What I want to do now is look at God's response at what happened to when Adam and Eve were confronted and responded to temptation. So let's see how God responds to what they did. And the passage we're looking at is Genesis 3 verses 9 and 10, just two short verses. Basically, several things are going on in this passage. The first thing that we'll see happen now is God confronting Adam in the garden, and then Eve and Satan as well. But the second thing he does is to pronounce several judgments, and he does so in the order in which the temptations occurred. So it starts with a judgment on Satan, and then goes on to address the woman and the man. So let's look at the very beginning of these events, beginning with God calling upon Adam. And it says in verse 9, "But the Lord called to the man, 'Where are you?' Verse 10, he answered, 'I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid.'" So the Lord God calls to Adam, and it's interesting because Adam had run away from the Lord and hid when he heard his voice. And when God calls him, the particular Hebrew word translated here is one used of a summons. In other words, an order is given to come and account for something. So he calls to Adam and he says, "Where are you?" Now let me ask you a question. Do you think God knew where Adam was? Of course he knew where he was. This scene kind of reminds me of when I was a disobedient little boy, and sometimes when I heard my dad coming after me to punish me, I'd run into a room and hide behind the door with his tea, and my father would come in the room and stand in the door and say, "Where are you?" knowing absolutely where I was already. Well, God knows where Adam is here, and his call is a call that's intended to provoke some kind of confession or at least an acceptance of responsibility. And Adam's reply is, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself." Please note this is not a genuine confession, because he's just offering excuses and rationalizing. Now, I've always had a passing interest in psychology over the years, and I've read many books in this area, and I read with interest one particular secular psychologist who chose to use this Genesis account as a perfect example of what he wanted to illustrate, which were psychological patterns called denial, rationalization, and justification. It seems we're all born with these impulses, and it started here with Adam, who passed them on to the whole human race. We are all inclined to do this sort of thing when we know we've done something wrong. Our explanations often just become excuses that end up blaming other people. And that is exactly what's going on here. So I wonder who Adam's going to blame on this occasion. Well, we'll find out in the next episode. Okay everyone, that's it for this time. Now the place to go for all the links to this ministry and other ministries and podcasts that I do is the podcast notes section of this podcast on the Buzzsprout website. There you'll find links to the Facebook page, my YouTube channel, the sister podcast, the Living in Faith Everyday podcast, and also links even to my SoundCloud page where I create the background music and sound design for this podcast. And there's also, even if you're that way inclined, a place where you can support the podcast and the other ministries to the tune of £1 a month, which really helps with the funding and costs of doing this. But other than that, I really trust you've been blessed by our time together, and I hope to see you all here again very soon.